Welcome to the Beau Show. Thanks for watching. It's my birthday today, so it's great to be taking another trip around the sun and doing it right here on the Beau Show with you. It's my honor to be working with NTD Television and the Epoch Times, who do the journalistic work that every other media company should be doing, pursuing truth and tradition. It's an honor to be on these airwaves and going on this journey with you. We've heard so many chants and calls for defunding the police in the aftermath of a slew of cases last year of alleged police brutality. These come in the wake of the more overt and jarring cases like, for instance, Derek Chauvin's knee on George Floyd's neck, to more nebulous cases where an officer might be using self-defense or shooting at a fleeing or resisting suspect. In a jerk reaction to this, many began demanding that governments defund the police, which would get rid of police departments entirely. According to a recent poll, only 18% of Americans support the defund the police movement, which was shouted during the Black Lives Matter protests. The Minneapolis City Council introduced a measure to abolish and replace their police, and New York, Seattle, D.C., and Los Angeles have cut police funding. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell had this to say about this idea at a recent event.
It's unfortunate. I think defunding the police has got to be one of the dumbest ideas ever surfaced by anyone in our country.
Homicides hit new records all across the country, especially in places like D.C. and Seattle. McConnell also said this on the Senate floor.
A small set of politicians may seize selfish opportunities for fame or fundraising if they defame and defund the police, but American families are paying a deadly price. Defunding the police isn't just a terrible idea for overall public safety. It's also a uniquely awful strategy for racial justice. One study recently confirmed that, quote, larger police forces save lives, and the lives saved are disproportionately black lives.
Isn't that interesting? That policing actually does more to save black lives than it does to harm them. And yet the barking mad on the left get hyped up on anti-cop rhetoric. I wonder how many of you are aware of the acronym ACAB. Have you seen it graffitied on property before? It stands for All Cops Are Bastards. This is the type of rhetoric you see today from protests to Congress. Speaking of Congress, here's what Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said recently about how to curb crime.
If we want to reduce violent crime, if we want to reduce the number of people in our jails, the answer is to stop building more of them. The answer is to make sure that we actually build more hospitals, we pay organizers, we get people mental health care and overall health care, employment, etc. It's to support communities, not throw them away.
AOC thinks that in order to solve crime, you just build less prisons. Violent crime is way up in New York City, over 70% higher in gun violence. But one of its representatives, AOC, sees the solution as reducing prisons and building hospitals and hiring community organizers. The anti-cop rhetoric coming from politicians, especially in these cities and states where crime is surging, it merely emboldens the criminals. Have we become a third world country? Another policy point that is being raised as we talk about police reform bills is something called qualified immunity, a legal principle in which police officers are immune from being sued in civil courts. Republicans are very much against getting rid of qualified immunity, as it would create a major disincentive to becoming a police officer. You put your life on the line every day to serve and protect, and now you have to worry about being sued in civil court personally. A bill in the House has passed that gets rid of qualified immunity, which makes every officer liable personally. Unsurprisingly, AOC and 10 other Democrats are worried that a bipartisan reform bill will retain qualified immunity, and she is entirely against that. Remember, she thinks building more hospitals and adding organizers will drive down the surge of violent crime. While it is highly unlikely that any bipartisan bill will abolish the police, that sentiment certainly has roots across the country. But when you get rid of law enforcement, who enforces the laws? Or rather, what is the point of creating law in the first place if it will become the wild, wild west? You'll have junkies shooting up in the street in front of your kids. Oh wait, that actually happens right now in places like Seattle. But you'd also have crimes of passion, hate crimes. And they think Stop AAPI Hate is important. But who is going to enforce that if you have no police? Who arrests someone for hitting an elderly Asian person like we've seen in all these clips? What's the disincentive or penalty for doing such a thing? We all learn as children that there are consequences for our actions. It was as simple as time out when we were young. We were removed from our friends and forced to sit there and think about what we did. You don't steal, you don't hit someone because you don't like them, you play fair, you don't cheat. But these very basic precepts are now being challenged in our adult lives. I live in South Florida, and the drivers down here are crazy and dangerous. And so I asked a cop one time coming out of a restaurant, what am I supposed to do with all these guys that think that I-95 is the Daytona 500? He said they simply don't have enough patrol officers to pull them over. So there's a tacit endorsement that you can drive however you want to drive. I think because I was in a terrible car wreck last year, maybe I have more sensitivity to this in the way people drive, but people are losing their basic common sense and respect for others' well-being. We have race wars, gang wars, crimes of passion, and crimes of, well, convenience, like I mentioned in my last episode, where Cynthia Nixon doesn't think shoplifters should be prosecuted. There's another wonderful New Yorker advocating for crime. AOC, Bill de Blasio, Gavin Newsom, Andrew Cuomo, Tim Walz, and Jacob Frey of Minnesota. Where is your sense of accountability to your constituents? These so-called leaders oversee some of the most crime-ridden parts of the country, but they do nothing about it. Instead of cleaning out corruption and finding the best, most well-qualified and well-trained officers we can, these leaders cut funding to police departments. I think it is fair to want accountability in our police departments and to ensure that they are trained well. But let's take a look at Minneapolis itself, because there was so much focus on this police force in the aftermath of the George Floyd death. When the first public hearing occurred there regarding cutting funding for the MPD, many voiced that they needed both police and reform. That would seem sensible. But there was a huge outcry to get rid of the police department altogether. In fact, it was advanced by the Minneapolis City Council. In spite of the fact that an African American is the current police chief, Chief Arredondo, he's been chief since 2017, when his predecessor was forced out after the death of Justine Damond, an Australian woman who called 911 in 2017 to report what she thought was a rape in progress near her home. After officers had come and deemed the scene safe, Damond walked out in her pajamas to approach the squad car, and Somali-American officer Mohammed Noor drew his weapon, shooting her in the abdomen and killing her. Noor is currently serving a 12-and-a-half-year term in prison. Because psychiatrists had raised concerns about Noor's fitness to be an officer, it does make one wonder why he was on the force. Just a few years later, of course, Officer Derek Chauvin pinned George Floyd down. The difference here is that when Noor shot and killed Damon, it was not considered racially motivated. But when Chauvin kneeled on Floyd's neck, it was considered absolutely racial. These are two Minneapolis police incidents just several years apart dealing with officers and victims of opposite races. But look where the attention went, and the notion that reform was necessary because it was assumed that the reason Floyd died was purely racial, with no mention of the previous Officer Noor shooting of Justine Damond. Now, it would seem, based on both the Damond and the Floyd deaths, that there very well could be major issues in the Minneapolis Police Department, which is now the job of Chief Arredondo. But it is interesting that after the Justine Damond death, that something like George Floyd could even happen. That brings up many other questions, from how the officers are trained, to the chiefs themselves, to the mayor, to former prosecutor Amy Klobuchar in Minnesota, to the governor. It is true that we all want accountability and responsibility from our police forces, without question, especially since it is our tax dollars going to them. But I think this conversation should not be relegated to a purely racial conversation, the way it was made out to be with George Floyd. There was no global movement or riots following the death of Justine Damond, but there was for George Floyd. Damond was an innocent civilian. Floyd was indeed a criminal, though not an imminent threat at that time that Chauvin was kneeling on his neck. This goes back to the need for police, but the need for reform. And then let's really look at the stats. Police interactions happen by the thousands every single day, and most go without incident or death, but we only hear about the ones where someone dies. We rarely hear about the ones where the officer dies. And although Officer Noor was Somali and Justine Damond was Caucasian, we do not hear cries for racial justice. There must be a balance between where we really need to be looking, which is in training methods, supervision, and the leaders who oversee these forces, rather than just presuming that an interaction was the result of racial profiling or true legitimate racism. Had I not been through a training simulation with the Denver Police Department, I don't know if I could even comment on this, but I have, and I know how hard it was, and frankly how life-threatening it was. But what Denver PD does may not be the same thing that Minneapolis PD does. The fact that Chauvin and 3 other officers of multiple races, by the way, did with George Floyd under the city's first black police chief is quite remarkable. Wouldn't Chief Arredondo have put in place training and methods that would likely have prevented Chauvin and others from conducting arrests the way that they did? Especially after what had happened with Justine Damond. The outrage only sparks when there is a way to somehow claim racial injustice. And yet they have yet to prove that these interactions were racially motivated at all. There is an argument to be made for excessive force. I get that. But is there really an argument for it to be race-based? Attorney Ben Crump and Al Sharpton certainly think so, which is why they show up every single time to get paid every time this happens. They are paid actors more than they are justice seekers. So when we examine the policing issue, to totally abolish a police force or to defund them is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It makes the assumption that all officers are bad with intent towards malice, who patrol streets looking for black and brown people to hunt down and kill. No logical person would think that. But if you get rid of police and replace it with these community forces or whatever it is they think can do the job, good luck with that when someone gets shot, or domestic abuse happens, or your apartment complex turns into a crack house. The fact remains that proper policing protects minorities far more than it threatens them. Chicago is a prime example. The black-on-black violent crime there is out of control. Without police, that prevalence skyrockets. You follow AOC's advice, you create less prisons, less police, less ICE, less Homeland Security, and then who are you going to blame when America goes to hell in a handbasket? There would be no consequence for crime. If you really boil down this conversation, the focus is always on the police's conduct, never the criminals. Look at Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri from a few years ago. Do you even remember that he had stolen merchandise from the convenience store and pushed people violently out of the way? Those who put themselves in bad positions by committing crimes don't help themselves when they resist. But all media tells you is that some innocent person was killed by police. They don't mention the crime, the why they were there in the first place. Now, every criminal deserves his or her day in court. That's due process. But in order to make it to that day in court, you have to stay alive. You have to comply. You have to abide once you've been caught. That has been totally lost in this debate. The focus has solely been on police conduct, not criminal conduct. I want an accountable force. I don't want anyone pulled over for no reason or accosted for doing nothing. But once you've committed the crime, you got to do the time. You can't play victim, and you can't play the race card. The same thing that happened to George Floyd happened to a white man named Tony Timpa by Dallas police officers. But you don't hear about that because it wasn't racially convenient. The accountability must be consistent across the board. Defunding the police completely overlooks the real issues and replaces them with issues of convenience. We all want accountability from our police forces. They are there to serve and to protect. Funding them places trust in them to protect us from theft, from murder, and many other unseemly crimes. We can demand that while also respecting them for the work that they do daily that goes completely unnoticed. You can't recruit great officers if you spit on them and you criticize their every move. I have yet to hear an argument made about reducing crime at the source, which is to prevent the crime from happening in the first place, which then reduces the interactions, which then reduces opportunity for unnecessary force or death. But statistically speaking, the murders in this country are not happening by police. They are happening by citizens. In 2020 alone, murder was up over 36%. In Miami, near where I live, there are shootings every single weekend. Do sane people really think that abolishing or defunding police will reduce that number? Come on, let's be sensible. I'm Beau, and that's the show.